Hey everybody, there was a question on the Discord asking to dig into the material designer for motion design in Unreal Engine 5, so this is what we'll be doing in this video. All the materials that you're seeing in this scene right now were created with material designer. Well, there is one exception, and that is these clones that are the background in this scene. If I select one of those, what you'll see is if I look at the material asset and hover over it, this is stone material from the Twin Motion materials. And that really brings us to our first point about material designer. You'll get the most out of it if you have a nice collection of textures to work with to begin. So for this example, I downloaded a number of free assets from Fab. One is the Twin Motion materials and the other is this 550 alphas. Both of these are free on Fab, and you can add them to your own project by clicking on the Fab button in your content browser. And then inside Fab, go ahead and start by looking for Twin Motion. So I'll type in Twin Motion into the search, hit enter. And in my case, the very first one is this Twin Motion materials pack. And when I click on that, you can see that there is an add to project button, and that will add these materials to your project. Now the materials will come in as material assets, but it'll also include all the various textures that were used to create these materials in the first place. And those textures can be really useful to us in Material Designer. Now the other pack is a number of alphas. So you can find that by typing in alpha, hit enter, and then in this case I'm interested in a free pack of alpha textures, so I'm going to go to price and filter on free. And here you'll see this big free edition pack. And so if I click on this, you can see that there's 550 alpha channel textures in here, and they're really good. This free pack is 512 by 512 pixels per texture. The author does have a number of higher resolution packs available. Here's one at 1024 pixels, 2048, and 4096. And each of these have really a very small price, so of course go ahead and support these creators. But for the purposes of this demo, and if you want to practice, there is no cost for the free edition, and you can use the Add to Project button to get those textures into your project. So let's go ahead and close that. And just to take a look at what that looks like, if I double click on alphas, you'll see a number of folders, but I can look at just the textures by clicking on my filter and choosing texture. And then here we can see that we have a variety of textures available in various patterns, as well as some grunge and that sort of thing. So that is particularly useful. And then also, let's just reset the filters for a second. If I go to Twin Motion materials, again, there's lots of folders, there are functions, there are levels, there are a lot of things in here, but we can use the filter button to look at just the texture assets, and here we'll find a number of assets that are different than alpha channels. So some of these are going to be color maps, some of these are going to include normal maps. So BC pretty much stands for base color, _N for normal map. So there's a variety of different kinds of textures here. Generally, these are all going to be red, green, blue, alpha. You can also import textures from outside. So for example, I went to this website called Free PBR. At Free PBR, you can find lots of PBR texture packs. So PBR, if you're not familiar with that, stands for physically based rendering materials. In the case of a texture pack, what you get is a number of different images that have red, green, blue values for the various types of PBR channels. So if we can go ahead and look at what I downloaded here, for example, if I go into subtle black granite, I could double click there and you'll see albedo stands for the base color, AO for ambient occlusion, there's a height map, metallic, whether or not it's metallic, it's basically a 1 or 0, a normal map, etc. So we'll get into these in a little bit, but you can always download these sets and use them with Material Designer. So with that said, let's dig into Material Designer itself. I'm going to use the shader ball as an example here. So if I go ahead and reset my filters and go into my Material Designer demo, I have the shader ball model here. You can find this. It's built built into Unreal Engine. To do that, in your content browser, go to Settings and make sure that both Show Engine Content and Show Plugin Content are both activated. And then you'll also want to show the Sources panel. This is the Sources panel right here. If I uncheck it, it goes away. If I check it, it's there. And in the Sources panel, if we go down here and click on Engine, we can go to the search and type in shader. And this gets us a whole lot of different things, but what we really want is a static mesh, the shader ball. So I can click on my filters, choose static mesh, and there's the shader ball. In this case, it's in a toolkit for Avalanche. And then you can copy this into your project so that you don't accidentally edit the one that's built into the engine. So in this case, I already have this copied into one of my folders, but I don't have it in my main content folder. So if I click and drag to content and release, I don't want to move it here. I want to copy it here. And now that is copied. And so if I click on content and you see that, well, I've got a few copies of it here, but I can deactivate my filter and go ahead and deactivate the search. And now you can see that it is right here in my content folder. One of the other copies is here in my Material Designer demo. So I'll drag that into my scene. Let's zero this out, 0 tab 0 tab 0 in the location details. I'll bring this forward and let's scale this up. And maybe we'll rotate it to face us here a little bit. Okay, so here's a mesh that is ready for materials, and this actually has 3 different what we call material sockets. So we can have one material for the outer shell, another material for this kind of inner structure, and then finally material that is for the Unreal U there in the center of that. So let's launch the Material Designer and start our first material. I'm going to do that with the element 0, the outer shell, and say create with Material Designer, and we're presented with our first Material Designer window. Now by default this is floating around, we can keep it there, but a lot of folks like to dock it next to the viewport, so I can click on the tab and drag to the right side of the viewport and release, and now it's docked here, and we'll always have that available to work with right next to the viewport. We will stick to new material for this demo. These material type buttons are just default setups for Material Designer. We can actually create more of these buttons, and maybe I'll cover that in a later video. For now, I'm just going to choose Emissive because it is the simplest of these presets. And with that selected, I can go ahead and click continue. And now we have our first Material Designer material. Now, there's nothing much to look at here. It's just black. And we have 3 bubbles here across the top: global settings, channels, and emissive color. So the first thing to know is that the global settings are the overall settings for this material. We're going to be using domain surface, meaning that the material that we're creating is intended to go on the surface of a mesh, and that's the focus of this particular video. Also, our blend mode is opaque, meaning that there is no transparency in this material, and we're going to stay with that also for the duration of this video. We will try the 2 different main shading models of opaque surface shaders though, and that is unlit and also default lit. With unlit, that's the default for the emissive color option, and what this is doing is ignoring all lighting and shadow and just giving us an output based on whatever is in the emissive channel. Each channel really is a collection of our red, green, blue alpha values, and they're processed differently by the material itself to calculate how light should look when it's bouncing off of the surface of our mesh. So we're going to stick with these settings for now. One other bubble here is channels, and this gives us access to activate and deactivate the various available channels. Right now, because we're set to unlit mode, most of the channels are not available to us. They're incompatible with unlit. And again, unlit is ignoring the behavior of light and shadow, and that's what all of these other channels are governing, so they're disabled at the moment. So let's go to emissive color and see what we have. here we have what we call stages or layers. So this works very much like After Effects or Photoshop, where right now I have a single layer and that has a texture in it, and a texture is just a 2D image. So if I were to find one of the alpha channel textures, for example, I'll go to Content in my browser and go to Alphas, and let's filter this by texture. And I'll just drag one of these textures right on there. Now we're getting that texture as the output of this surface. It almost looks like it's illuminating, and we can control how this texture is mapped over the UV surface of our mesh by scrolling down here, and we can offset it, left and right. So this is moving left and right. You can see the effect here as well as on our mesh. This is vertical, up and down, and again, this is V vertical, and this is U horizontal. And I can set those offsets back to 0, tab 0. And then also there's tiling, and this is essentially the scaling of the texture on our UV surface. So right now 1:1 means that the left edge of the surface is getting the left edge of the texture, the right edge of the surface is getting the right edge of the texture. If I were to set tiling to 2, what we'll see is this texture will be doubled up, and so there's actually a little seam here. If we go up to 10, that'll be more obvious, and you can kind of see the repetition here in this flat plane. Notice that repetition is not quite as obvious on our object here. And this is just one layer or stage in our Material Designer channel for emissive color. So I could, for example, add another layer by using this plus button. So I will go ahead and add a solid color layer in this case. So a texture layer uses a 2D texture. A solid color allows me to define a color. So this is in normal mode right now, so that means it's basically completely covering over the layer beneath, and so whatever color I select here is what will be coming off of this particular surface. Now I can control the opacity of the selected layer. So right here is the opacity. Here's my selected layer. So I can click and drag this down, and now we're getting a blend. And so you could imagine this as a multiplier, and essentially if I make this, let's say 0.25, well then the color values in this top layer are being multiplied by 0.25. The color values in the lower layer are being multiplied by 1 minus that 0.25, so this is multiplied by 0.75, and then the result is added up, and this is the result. We also have the ability to add effects to these. So if I wanted to do levels, for example, let's go ahead and delete this top layer. This layer right here is mostly grayscale, so I can add an effect, and I'll go to color, and I'm going to use color levels. Again, very similar to Photoshop. If I increase the input min, it'll make darker shades of gray get closer to black. So I can click on this value, and if I increase the value here, you can see that the darker grays are being absorbed into black. And likewise, if I have my input max, I can lower that white value, and that'll absorb the brighter grays, and you can see now we have much different pattern here. And so this is another way of making use of these textures, is we don't have to accept them as they are. We have the ability to adjust them quite a bit. Definitely would encourage you to take a look at a lot of these. You'll find many of them are familiar to you from Photoshop, Affinity Photo, After Effects, and such. Another feature here is the ability to change how layers apply to one another. So again, let's go ahead and add a solid color layer. And in normal mode, we're just covering over the layer below. So if I were to select this color and I make it purple, it's a solid purple. If I change the blending mode, though, of this layer, say if I multiply, well, now what we should be doing is multiplying this purple by whatever is below it. And so now anything that's white here is shown as purple. Any darker values are being multiplied and darkened. So those are the basic mechanics of the Material Designer itself. And this emissive color is pretty simple. So let's get into something a little more like what we're seeing in the background. For example, let's say I want to make this look like a kind of a dull metal. So what I'm going to do is switch into fully lit mode. So global settings, I'm going to keep surface and opaque, but from unlit, I'm going to switch to default lit. And once we have that activated, now in the channels panel, we'll have more channels available. And so in this case, I'm going to go with base color, roughness, metallic, and that's probably enough. In fact, with that, I really don't necessarily need the emissive color. So let's just work with base color, roughness, and metallic for now. Now you can see with these 3 channels activated, I have 3 channel bubbles here, and they let me change between layer stacks for each one of these channels. So each channel controls a different aspect of the physically based rendering shader here. So for example, the color itself right now, it has this UV pattern that's mostly grayscale. I'm going to tile that a little bit so that we get a little more detail, and we'll just keep that color for now. Roughness governs, well, how sharp and shiny are the reflections. So right now we have a medium gray texture here. I'm going to switch from being a texture to a color. So with an existing layer right here, this symbol indicates that this is a texture layer. But if I click that, I can change this to a solid color. And default of a black value in roughness means that it is not rough at all. So you can see we have very sharp reflections. And if I go ahead to the metallic channel, I can choose whether this is or is not a metallic material. It changes the degree to which light is absorbed or immediately reflected by the surface of this material. So right now we have a texture here. Again, I'm going to switch this to a solid color. And a value of 0, black, means that this is not metallic. And if I click this color, I'm going to bring that all the way up to white. And so the value is 1. And now you see a much more metallic reflection here. So generally, the metallic channel should either be 1 or 0. There's not a whole lot of sense in the in-between values. I mean, I suppose if you want to be creative, you could move them, but generally 0 means it's not metallic and 1 means it is metallic. So now if I have my metallic reflective textured ball, I can go back to roughness, and let's increase roughness. So I'll click on this color, and if I use a darker shade of gray, you can see that we're starting to lose the sharpness in the reflection. So increase this further. And so there's our result. If I increase this all the way up, we have a very, very dull metal. Let's bring this down a little bit. Now, if we put a texture in the roughness, then we can get a sense of maybe some grunge or dirtiness, right? So I'm going to say okay, and then switch back from color to a texture. And let's find one of the little speckled textures here. Again, in this alpha channel pack, I'll use this alpha 18, drag that in. And now you can see that the various bright and dark patterns here in the texture are affecting what is and isn't rough on this object. So let's go ahead and add an effect. I want to invert this. I want the main material to be dark, so it's shiny, but the speckles to be bright. And those are maybe some material, some water splashed on and then dried, and the residue is left behind. So again, I'll go to color for my effects, and I'll choose invert RGB, and that'll invert the grayscale. There we go. And that should be just on the roughness. And next, what I'll do is add a levels, so color and levels. And again, if I adjust the input min, then darker grays will be absorbed into black, and black for roughness is shiny. So I can increase this all the way up, and we have perfectly shiny. And as I bring this down, we have starting to get some evidence of smudges. Now, maybe what I also want to do is leave some color residue on these smudges. So what I could do is say, okay, and let's go to our base color channel. Let's add a color layer, and I'm going to make this color layer kind of a bright gray. Say okay. You can start to see how that looks in the areas that are rough. And then as an alpha channel, I'm going to go ahead and use this same exact alpha channel as I did on the roughness. There we go. And finally, I'll need to invert this. So again, we want the white color, or this gray color, to be passed down where the smudges are. So I'm going to invert my alpha. So instead of inverting color, I'll hit my FX, go to alpha, and invert alpha. And there we go. So now we've got these smudges on our otherwise shiny sphere. So that's just some of the things that we can do. You can also use a fully realized physically based rendering material texture set. So I can go back to my browser here. All right, so this is the subtle granite. So let's go ahead and use this granite as the inner color for our shader sphere here. So what I'll do is use the Create with Material Designer button here for element 1. And then instead of creating any material type, I'll go back to my little browser here. I'm selecting all these PNG files, and I need to bring them into my project before I use them. So let's just go to content, and let's deactivate our filters. I will go ahead and create a new folder for PBR textures, double click, and then I will drag them into my project. All right, so with these granite textures in here, I'll use Control-Shift-S to save everything all at once, Control-Shift-S. And again, I've got Material Designer started here, but I haven't picked anything. I will select all of these textures, Control-A, and then just drag them onto the Material Designer. When I release, we get the Material Designer Texture Set Builder. So this has automatically identified albedo as a base color, the normal map for normal, metallic, and so on. By the way, note that the preview didn't map to any of the color channels, so that is left unused, and that's exactly the way we want it. So I'll go ahead and hit accept, and now this internal structure is using this black granite with a little bit of tiling apparently in probably the normal map. So you can see this is using base color, roughness, metallic, normal, ambient occlusion, and displacement. Generally, actually, Unreal applies displacement to geometry, so having that in the Material Designer, it's not entirely necessary, but it's not doing any damage either. So I'm just going to go ahead and leave that on. The normal map here is probably where this grid is. So if I don't want this grid, I could go ahead and switch from a texture to a solid color. And now we have a continuously smooth shader here. I think what we want is kind of like this overall mid purple color. So I'll select this and get my sampler and select that and say okay. And so there we go. There is a nice smooth granite in there. Now I have other texture sets, right? So if I go here, let's go to my PBR sets and get silver, and I will select all of those, drag them in to Unreal. And then with those selected, let's start a new material for our U and create a Material Designer material. These are all selected, drag them in. We'll say accept. And now we have a nice bright silver for the logo. Control-Shift-S to save everything. And finally, I am going to use one more texture set here, PBR sets. I have this striped weave. It's a fabric. So let's click on all of these, drag them into Unreal. And I want to apply them to the outer shell. So what I can do is select my outer shell, edit with Material Designer. Here is the material that we've been working on here, and I can click and drag these textures directly into the existing Material Designer. So the first thing that happens is those different textures get assigned to our various channels. So I'll accept that, and now I have an option. If I want to, I can delete the existing layers by clicking the yes button. I can add layers by using no, or I could cancel all of this and just leave everything as they are. In this case, I'm going to go ahead and click on yes. So I'm going to get rid of what I've been working on here and instead replace it with this fabric. So as soon as I say yes, we have our fabric, and now we have a nice soft muted fabric here. Now what's nice about this is I could go to base color, and instead of having this neutral white, I can go ahead to my effects and add a color effect. In this case, I'm going to use color tint. And with that added, I can go ahead and tint this maybe purple or blue or red, any color I want. And what's nice about this, I'll just say okay at the moment, this is now still that same set of textures that we got from the website, but now we have the ability to tint it any color we like. And over here, one of the things I haven't shown yet is that we can expose these values either to sequencer and animate them, or we can expose them to remote control. So I'll go through more examples of that later on, but I just wanted to show that you can indeed, for example, expose this parameter to remote control, and then in my motion design remote control, I have that as a parameter. I think I can click and drag. Nope, I have to create a controller for color, and let's set that color to match what we have right now. We'll say okay. And then finally, I'm going to bind this controller to this property. And so now this controller in remote control should be able to adjust the color. And now if I wanted to use this fabric in some motion design setup, or motion graphics, where I wanted to change this color based on a set of different team logos, I'd be able to set those different colors in Rundown so that I could get different colors for different pages when I was playing them out for broadcast. So a couple other things to show is there's a lot of capabilities with emissive materials. So this word material is being lit from within using an emissive material designer setup. So I'm going to do that with the this granite material inside my shader ball. So let's go ahead and edit the element 1. This is that granite material. So right now we don't have an emissive color activated. So what I'm going to do is go to channels and scroll down. Emissive color is available. So I'll activate that and select that emissive color. Let's just, do something similar to this material here. So let's switch this to color, and we'll give it a nice bright blue, something like this. And now it's glowing blue, but it doesn't look like lights. It's like just glowing like it's radioactive. So to get a pattern like this, we're going to use the alpha channel. So let's go back to our alphas and activate our textures filter. And what I'll do is look for a pattern. I think this particular pattern is like 309 or something like that. Scrolling down, here's some patterns. Okay, here's 322. Let's use 322. So I'll just drag this into my alpha. So let's select that alpha texture and drag 322 into the alpha. And this should be set up. I guess we need to adjust our tiling here. Let's increase the tiling. And there we go. Now we're starting to glow. But the glow isn't very bright. So let's select that color, click on the color, and that is because the value is only 1. If we increase this to, say, 10, now it looks like we're glowing with a lot of lights, and we can say OK. And let's adjust our tiling again for our emissive alpha channel material. And let's see what other options we have here. Let's take a look at, I think there were some hex patterns here. Fortunately, they're all just named T alpha. So let's try this one here. Bring this into our alpha texture. There we go. And increase that. So we can get different kinds of lighting patterns in here. One of the interesting things is that I can also make this look like it's like an old-timey scan line. So I can drag this right into my alpha channel. Let's increase our tiling. now what I can do is actually add an animator. So earlier I showed how you could use the sequencer by assigning keyframes. I can also use my procedural animators. So if I right click on this and choose time, for example, time means it's just going to move steadily over time. I will do, not tiling actually, I want to do the offset. So let's right click on offset. We'll do time, and we're just going to go in offset vertical. So we want it to go up and down in the opposite direction of the perpendicular direction of the lines that we have. So we're offsetting in Y, and now that's applied. Now you can see that's animating. It's a little crazy, so let's edit that animator. We'll find that in the operator stack. And we have to have our shader ball selected. We do, and we need to go to the operator stacks animators page, and here are the settings for this. And one of the things we can do is slow this down. One of the ways of doing that is lowering the cycle duration. Another is to adjust the amplitude. So if I go ahead and change the cycle duration to something much longer, let's make it 10 seconds. There we go. Now this is much slower, and that looks pretty cool. Another thing I can do is change the cycle gap duration, and I think right here, frame rate. Let's change the frame rate. We're doing a nice smooth 30 frames a second here. If I activate frame rate and change this to 10 frames a second, now this is a little more stuttery. And again, let's go ahead and add a little bit of grunge to this, right? So I'm going to add another layer. We'll make it a texture layer. And I will take this alpha texture right here, this grungy one, drop that on. There we go. Okay, so now we've got our animated lines over the grunge. Let's go ahead and invert our RGB on this. So we'll FX, color, invert RGB. And then let's move this around randomly. There we go. So now we're starting to see some grunge here within the lines, and we want that to move around randomly. And so for random movement, we'll want an offset, right click, and we'll use wiggle. So I'm going to wiggle both offset X as well as Y. And now we have a lot more breakup to this. So let's just look at a couple more things before we head out. One is this kind of diamond plate metallic material that's on the word designer back here. So let's build that up from scratch. And then we'll also get into how we can save our materials after we've designed them. So for this material, I'm basically using a very smooth, so not rough, metallic material with color that also has a normal map that's resulting in this kind of diamond plate appearance. So let's build this up from a fresh material. What I'll do is, again, go to my details panel, and for the outer element 0, I'm just going to go ahead and reset that. So now we're back to our default material, and now I will create a material with the material designer. And for this, I'll start with opaque, since it's going to be a physically based rendering material, and then click on continue. Now by default, we have base color and emissive. So let's go to channels. I won't need emissive. I'll deactivate that. I will need to define roughness, because the default roughness is a gray value that isn't necessarily shiny enough. We're also going to want the normal map and metallic. So for the metallic channel, we're going to set that to 1. Roughness, we're going to lower that, and then we're going to apply a normal map from the twin motion materials to give us this diamond plate. So let's get to work. We'll go to the base color channel first. To create this material, we'll just select purple or magenta. So I'm just going to change this from being a texture to a solid color. And let's set that color to a magenta. Something saturated like that. We'll say OK. We do have a yellow light on it, so it has a little bit of a strange look. We'll improve this by going to roughness. Likewise, we'll set this to a color. And letting that go down to 0 black is exactly what we want. That'll give us sharp reflections once our material compiles. And next I'll go to metallic and again set this to a color. And in this case, we do want this to be solid white 1. And there we go. So our roughness is down to 0. Our metallic is up at 1. And our color is purple. So we can say OK to all of that. And finally, we're going to apply our normal map. So we'll go to normal. We'll leave this set to texture. Let's go to our twin motion materials. The texture filter is still on, and we have twin motion materials selected. And right here is this 3D wall _n. I mean, there's a lot of different normal maps available. So if we want to, we can go to the search and type in _n, and that'll give us just the normal maps for the most part. I mean, there'll be a few materials that happen to have a _n in them that aren't the normal map per se. The one that I'm using for this designer word is this 3D wall 03. So I will drag that into my texture and it's applied nicely here. However, the tiling is too large to be able to see it on our shader ball. So let's increase our tiling. And now you can see that normal map over the surface of our shader ball. So that's how this was created. Now, of course, we can try different textures. Each time we change our texture, we can adjust and get this kind of a pillowy look. Here's a wavy, crinkly texture. There we go. So you can see just by changing this normal map, we can get a very different look here. Likewise with roughness. We can blur our reflections just a bit. Let's tile our normal map. There we go. Now another thing we could do is maybe make kind of like a gold inlay here. So if I go to base color, I'm going to add a layer. It'll be a solid color. And we'll want this color to be kind of a golden amber. There we go. I'll say OK to that. And now let's go deactivate our search here. And let's get some kind of like a marble vein look. Maybe we type in the word marble for the twin motion materials. Let's take this marble right here and drag that into our alpha channel for the gold. And then, of course, we'll use levels from color to blacken the grays. And lighten the light grays. This should give us, set this to 0.5 as a value. And we'll set this. We don't want to get as high as 0.5, so ease off on it a little bit. There we go. Okay. And finally, we can tile this. And this time I'm going to go down and increase the size, something like this. And so now we have kind of impurities across there. So if I like how this looks and I want to save it, I can use the disk up here and click on Save As. And let's make sure I'm in the folder that I want to save it in. So I'm going to go to Content. Let's deactivate our texture filter and deactivate our search. I'm going to go into my PBR textures folder for this. And now I will go click Save. And here is the PBR textures. Of course, I misspelled PBR. How's that? And let's just call this Metal 1. And save that. And there it is. The shader ball will update in a little bit. And now I have a save button if I want to make changes, or I can use Save As. So let's go ahead and first save the changes we have here. Here we are. And next, let's save as. Let's call this Metal 2. And And now what we'll do is remove our gold layer. And let's make it a little rougher. Okay. That should update. And here it updated on the shader, but it didn't update here. And that is because when we hit save, we started editing the saved material rather than the material that is applied to this actor. So if I click on Control-Shift-S, we'll save everything. And now I can click and drag this metal onto my actor. And we're seeing that here. Since this is applied and I hit edit now, I'm working on this asset. Again, I can use Save As. Let's call this Metal 3. I'll take Metal 3 and apply it. And let's change our base color to something like blue. And make sure we save our changes. So there's a survey of a number of the core features of the Material Designer. You can see that there is a wide variety of results that you can get from it very, very quickly. You can save them and reuse them, and of course expose various parameters to remote control as well as sequencer so that these values can be animated as well as apply procedural animations. I hope this helps. Until next time, have fun.